Some crimes are buried, not beneath earth, but within the very walls that shelter us. It begins with a Swiss banker's plea and a snowbound chalet whose silence conceals a tale of betrayal, blackmail, and death. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let us step into the storm together and follow Holmes as he unravels the secret that winter itself tried to keep. It was upon a bleak morning in the depth of winter that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend in the familiar comfort of our rooms at Baker Street. A heavy frost had settled upon London during the night, so that the pavements glittered like glass, and the passing hansoms moved slowly and with cautious steps along the slippery thoroughfare. From where I sat by the window, I could discern the pale light of a sun half smothered by fog, its rays struggling against the grey oppression of the season. Within doors, the contrast was all the more remarkable. The fire in our grate blazed merrily, and the air was filled with the faint aroma of burning coal mingled with Holmes's inevitable pipe. My companion was in one of those moods of restless energy which were wont to seize him when the city's humdrum rhythm yielded no case worthy of his peculiar genius. He rose abruptly from his chair, paced across the rug, paused to glance at the mantel, and resumed his seat with the suddenness of a man whose mind is ever at war with inaction. I had learned to read these signs well, for they often heralded either the outpouring of his remarkable deductions or the advent of some client whose misfortunes would soon claim our attention. It was indeed, in such a moment of uneasy silence, that my eye was caught by a small object resting upon the hearthrug, and I perceived that Holmes's own gaze had already fastened upon it. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, bending with his long fingers to lift the article. It was a pair of gloves, of excellent quality, though somewhat worn, the soft kid leather darkened by use, and the lining frayed at the wrist. He held them up to the light of the window, his eyes glittering with that keen intensity which spoke of a mind already weaving threads into a pattern unseen by ordinary vision. "They are of foreign make," he murmured, turning them slowly in his hand. "Note the stitching, finer than the English craftsman's habit. The left is looser than the right, betraying the owner's habit of removing it in haste. The faint stain near the thumb is of ink, not soil, which proclaims a man of letters rather than of toil. And yet, see here, the wear along the palm suggests constant pressure, as though he carried a stout cane or handled ledgers daily. A banker beyond doubt, though one with nervous habits, for the inner lining is torn by restless fingers." I could not repress an exclamation, for in the brief span of a minute he had breathed life into the inanimate article, conjuring before me the picture of its absent possessor. Holmes smiled faintly at my astonishment. "The world is full of voices, Watson, if only one will listen," he said. "A pair of gloves may speak more eloquently than a dozen witnesses." Even as he laid them down upon the table, the sound of hurried steps upon the stair reached our ears. "You astound me continually, Holmes," I declared, shaking my head in admiration. "I confess I should have seen nothing in those poor gloves beyond the fact that they were well worn and recently dried by our fire." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "It is simplicity itself," he returned. "Each detail cries aloud to the trained observer. The difficulty lies not in perceiving, but in choosing which voice to heed." I could not help but laugh, though with genuine warmth. "And yet, my dear fellow, if you would but temper your brilliance with a grain of humility, the world might greet your deductions with less incredulity. Humility, Watson, is a virtue better suited to clergymen than to consulting detectives," he answered. "The truth is neither modest nor vain. It is simply the truth." Before I might frame a retort, a sudden rap sounded sharply at the door below. The sound was brisk and urgent, echoing even through the thickness of the stairwell. Holmes glanced toward the clock upon the mantel and arched his brows. "Not the milkman at this hour," he remarked dryly. "We shall see whether our gloves are to be matched with their master." Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread approached, and her voice, tinged with curiosity, reached us. "A gentleman, sir, foreign by his manner of speech," He begs to be admitted at once." Holmes cast me a quick look, one of those glances which spoke volumes without utterance. His eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a mind anticipating fresh engagement. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," said he, settling back into his chair with the composure of a man about to play his opening move upon the chessboard of circumstance. I confess my own pulse quickened, for I sensed that the case of the morning was already upon us. The door opened to admit a tall, spare gentleman, whose appearance bespoke both distinction and distress. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and his pale features were drawn tight, as though with prolonged anxiety. He clutched his hat in both hands, and I noticed that the gloves which should have adorned them were conspicuously absent. "Pray be seated," Holmes said, with that grave courtesy he reserved for clients in evident trouble. "You have come, I think, upon no trifling errand." The stranger bowed slightly and took the proffered chair. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his lips trembling, and his gaze darting about the room as though fearful of pursuit. At length, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "My name is Franz Adler. I am of Switzerland. I come to you, Mr. Holmes, because there is none other who will heed my fears. A shadow lies upon my family's home, a chalet in the Bernese Alps, and with it a danger I dare not name aloud." As he spoke these words, I perceived Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest, while I myself felt the first chill of that mystery, which was to carry us far from London's hearth into the very heart of the mountains. The gentleman who now entered our sitting-room presented a figure of distinction, though care had evidently pressed heavily upon him. He was tall and somewhat spare of frame, his countenance pale and marked with lines that bespoke anxiety rather than advancing years. His hair, once dark, was already streaked with silver, and his eyes, large and sombre, glanced about the room as though he feared unseen witnesses. His bow was of studied politeness, yet the tremor of his lips betrayed a deeper agitation. Holmes rose at once, inclining his head with that grave courtesy which few could resist. "You are welcome, sir. Pray, be seated. You have travelled far, I perceive, and not without urgency." The stranger gave a slight start at this observation, but complied with the invitation, sinking into the chair opposite Holmes. For a few moments he clasped his hat upon his knee in silence, struggling visibly with the weight of his emotions, while I, observing from my accustomed seat, could not but remark that he carried about him the air of a man compelled against his will into some perilous disclosure. It was thus, with hesitance and dread, that Herr Franz Adler first laid his case before us. I have seldom witnessed in any client such tokens of suppressed agitation as in this Swiss gentleman. His hands, finely shaped and long-fingered, quivered ceaselessly upon the brim of his hat, while at intervals his gaze darted to the door as though to assure himself of privacy. His voice, when at last he spoke, was low and hurried, yet carried the accent of one accustomed to command in more tranquil hours. There was about him the unmistakable bearing of refinement, the polish of education and social standing, and yet beneath it lurked a certain hunted look, as of a man pursued by shadows unseen. It struck me forcibly that here sat not merely a client with a problem of property or inheritance, but a soul heavily burdened with fear. Holmes, who had been observing with that hawk-like intensity of his, leaned forward slightly, ready to prompt the tale. "My family, Mr. Holmes," Adler began at length, "has for generations held property in the Bernese Oberland, a solitary chalet perched upon the mountainside above the valley of Lauterbrunnen. To most, it is but a rustic dwelling, designed for summer retreat and winter sport, yet to us it has ever borne the significance of an ancestral trust. My father repaired it often, and my sister, after her marriage, made it her chosen refuge. The place is lonely, too lonely perhaps, for it stands apart from the village, surrounded by thick pine woods, and cut off in winter by snow that renders the approach arduous." He paused, pressing his brow as though summoning courage. "Yet," he continued, "there has ever clung to it a whisper of secrecy. Certain villagers mutter that the chalet is accursed, that strange figures have been seen in its vicinity, and that lights have burned at untimely hours. My sister dismissed these tales as mountain superstition, yet I could not wholly banish their effect. To me, the chalet has ever seemed a place where silence lies too heavily, as though it covered more than mere snow. I confess the picture he drew, with its mingling of beauty and menace, set my imagination curiously on edge. It was there, Adler resumed, that my sister, who had been widowed these 3 years, made her home with her only daughter. Last autumn, word reached me in Zurich that she had been found lifeless in her chamber, her face composed in what was pronounced a peaceful repose. The physician of the village gave it as his opinion that her death was due to failure of the heart, induced, he said, by the mountain air and by the griefs she had endured. The authorities accepted the verdict without demur. Here the banker's voice broke, and he struggled for composure. But, gentlemen, he went on with sudden fervour, I am convinced it was not so. I knew my sister's constitution to be sound. I knew also that her mind had been troubled of late. Certain words dropped in her letters hinted at secrets, at dangers she dared not name. When I beheld her face in death, I seemed to read upon it not peace, but the shadow of dread fulfilled. Holmes inclined his head gravely, his fingers steepled before him, as though every syllable were being weighed. The estate, modest though it be, passes now to her daughter Clara. Adler continued, his eyes clouding with evident distress. She is but in her 20th year, a gentle and impressionable creature, of delicate health and retiring habits. Since her mother's death, she has clung to the chalet with a stubbornness which alarms me, though she will not confide the reason. To all outward entreaty she is deaf, yet her letters to me are filled with a tone of guarded anxiety, as though she writes with eyes over her shoulder. He drew a trembling breath. I fear for her, Mr. Holmes. I fear that some menace, hidden within those walls, has not died with her mother, but lingers still to entrap the child. She will not abandon the place, yet she dares not reveal its true nature. What is more, she shuns my aid, as though the very bond of family were tainted by the shadow that clings about that dwelling. The banker's lips tightened, and his glance beseeched Holmes as a drowning man might clutch at a lifeline. It is to you, sir, that I turn, Adler said, leaning forward in his chair, his whole frame quivering with suppressed emotion. The village authorities dismiss my fears as folly. The physician repeats his verdict. The police shrug their shoulders. Yet I know, yes, I know, that foul play has been done, and that danger yet remains. My position forbids me to stir idle scandal, but my conscience will not suffer me to stand idle whilst my niece languishes in peril. Holmes's keen gaze never left the speaker's face. You suspect, then, that there may be hidden papers, perhaps of value, or even treasure, which would give motive to villainy? Adler inclined his head. Such a possibility I cannot deny. My father spoke in guarded tones of documents entrusted to our keeping, documents of import to men whose names I dare not utter. If such exist, they may be the very key to all these mysteries. He clasped his hands together, the gesture of one pleading at the bar of justice. Mr. Holmes, will you not act, discreetly, swiftly, and with the full strength of your art, to save my niece and unearth the truth? Our departure from London was marked by that peculiar mingling of haste and gravity which so often accompanied Holmes upon his foreign expeditions. We crossed the Channel under a leaden sky, the waters rough and the wind biting with winter's force. Yet my companion betrayed neither discomfort nor distraction, for he had withdrawn into that impenetrable reserve which suggested his mind was already grappling with the unseen fibres of the case. Through France, our journey continued by rail, past villages, silent beneath frost, and fields, slumbering beneath the pall of snow. The further we went, the sharper grew the air, until at last the outlines of the Jura yielded to the mighty Alps themselves, their jagged crowns white against the evening heavens. I confess that, As I gazed upon those towering peaks, a curious unease stole over me. It seemed as though nature herself reared a barrier to warn intruders from some secret she had chosen to conceal. Holmes, noting my abstraction, allowed himself the faintest smile, though he uttered no word. Thus it was, with hearts half stirred by awe and half by foreboding, that we approached the very land in which tragedy had already cast its shadow. From Interlaken, we proceeded by a mountain railway, the narrow line clinging precariously to the slopes, while beneath us the valley fell away in dizzying descents. At each turn, new vistas opened, glittering glaciers, sombre forests of pine, and torrents rushing wildly down the gorges. I could scarce restrain my exclamations of wonder, though Holmes sat silent, his keen gaze fixed not upon the landscape, but upon some private vista of the intellect. As the railway ended, we transferred to a sleigh, drawn by two sturdy horses, whose breath steamed in the frosty air. Wrapped in heavy rugs, we pressed on through drifts that half buried the winding track. The bells at the horses' necks gave forth a melancholy music that echoed strangely against the mountainsides. I observed Holmes draw forth Adler's letters once more, perusing them by the waning light. He made certain brief notes in his pocketbook, unmoved by the grandeur around us. For myself, I could not resist a sense that we were ascending not merely into alpine solitude, but into the very heart of a mystery where human fear and guilt might be hidden as deeply as the chalets were buried beneath the snow. At length, the sleigh turned from the main track and followed a narrower path that wound steeply upward through dense woods of fir. The night had fallen by the time the driver pointed ahead to a cluster of lights glimmering faintly through the trees. With a jolt, the sleigh came to a halt before a broad, timbered dwelling whose roof sagged beneath the weight of snow. "This is the Adler Chalet, gentlemen," said our guide, with a gesture of mingled respect and unease. He would not remain a moment longer than duty compelled, and, having unloaded our modest baggage, he vanished swiftly into the night. I surveyed the house with mixed feelings. Its stout beams and shuttered windows spoke of age and endurance, yet there was about the place a certain grimness, as though it stood apart from the world. The surrounding forest pressed close upon it, hemming it round with shadow. Holmes surveyed the scene with quiet intentness, his keen eyes travelling from the snow-clad roof to the dark outlines of the attic windows. "A fit stage for our drama, Watson," he murmured. With that, we crossed the threshold into the abode where the heart of the mystery awaited. We were received in the hall by a young woman whose pale features and rigid bearing at once proclaimed her to be Clara Adler. She was of slight build, her fair hair drawn back severely, and her large eyes, though handsome, were clouded by an expression of wariness which chilled me more than the alpine air. "You come at my uncle's bidding," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I fear he has done ill to summon you. The past should not be disturbed, nor the dead called to judgment. Nothing good can come of it." Holmes bowed with studied courtesy. "We disturb nothing, mademoiselle, save in the cause of truth. If there is danger, it is better faced in the open air than left to fester in the dark." Her lips trembled, and for an instant I fancied I saw gratitude flicker across her countenance. Yet she turned quickly, beckoning us within. There was a coldness in her manner, a reserve born less of hostility than of dread. Thus, our first encounter with Clara Adler left me with the conviction that she was both victim and sentinel. Guarding some secret, she could neither confess nor escape. The household proved to consist of two elderly retainers, Keller the steward and his wife, both Swiss of the mountain stock, their faces lined with years, yet betraying glances too swift to be wholly guileless. They greeted us with a formality bordering on reluctance, and I observed in them a curious eagerness to anticipate Clara's commands, as though they held her in awe. Holmes, for his part, appeared absorbed in trifles, the lingering scent of wax in the corridor, the faint draught from above, and the locked door upon the attic landing which Clara passed in silence. His gaze lingered there longer than courtesy permitted, and I saw his brows contract in that fashion which to me was as the striking of a clock, denoting that his mind had registered some hidden import. As we were shown to our rooms, Holmes leaned toward me. "You perceive, Watson, that this house is no ordinary dwelling. Its walls harbour secrets that weigh heavily upon its inmates. We have crossed half of Europe to confront shadows, and we shall find them." I could not but shiver, for his words seemed less a prediction than the solemn announcement of a fate already unfolding. Holmes began his examination of the chalet with that quiet thoroughness which I had so often admired in him. To the casual eye, the house appeared but an ordinary alpine dwelling, timber walls darkened by smoke, floors of rough-hewn boards, and furniture of simple craft. Yet I could see, by the manner in which my companion's gaze lingered upon hinges, corners, and floor joints, that he was reading signs invisible to the rest of us. He passed slowly from room to room, stooping to examine a scratch upon a table, pausing before a window latch, and tapping gently upon the panels of the walls. His movements were unhurried, and his expression one of absorbed meditation. Clara Adler, who followed us with evident unease, grew restless beneath his scrutiny, while the steward Keller shifted from foot to foot, as though resentful of the intrusion. To me, the dwelling seemed to exhale an atmosphere of secrecy. I could not say whether it was the heavy silence of the mountain woods outside or the evident tension of its occupants, but I felt as though we trod not within a home, but within a chamber of hidden histories. Holmes gave no verdict, but his eyes glinted with expectation. In the principal sitting room, Holmes knelt suddenly before the great hearth, where logs smouldered beneath their weight of ash. With the tongs, he sifted through the grey powder until he uncovered fragments of paper half consumed by the flames. To me, they appeared nothing more than formless scraps, the ink blurred and the edges curled. But Holmes, bending close, extracted one fragment and held it against the light. "See here, Watson," said he. "The word is German, verrat. It signifies betrayal." The syllables seemed to fall heavily in that silent room, and Clara uttered a faint cry, pressing her hand to her lips. "It is plain," Holmes continued quietly, "that someone has sought to destroy a correspondence, and to do so with haste. Fire tells no tales, yet even ashes have tongues to those who listen." He laid the fragment carefully upon the mantelpiece, his lips compressed in thought. To my mind, the discovery imparted a darker hue to the atmosphere of the place. If the chalet had been haunted by superstition before, it was now touched by the shadow of human treachery. Holmes rose, his glance travelling to the door that led deeper into the house. In a narrow storeroom at the rear of the chalet, Holmes paused again. Upon a rack stood several pairs of snowshoes, their rawhide bindings stiff with frost. He examined them minutely, drawing one pair down and placing them upon the floor. "Note, Watson," he said, "this set is irregular. The left shoe is clearly of larger frame than the right. It is not the work of the craftsman, for each is genuine of its kind, but of different manufacture." I bent closer, perceiving at last the discrepancy. "Perhaps an accident of storage," I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "Hardly. No man of the mountains would endure such discomfort unless pressed by urgent need. To my eye, this suggests haste, the choice of a desperate intruder who could not procure a proper pair." His remark, so calmly uttered, struck me with a chill. The thought that a stranger had already penetrated the chalet lent substance to the fears which Franz Adler had confided in Baker Street. Holmes replaced the snowshoes with care, but I saw that his expression had sharpened. To him, the irregular pair was not mere accident, but a thread in that dark web which was beginning to reveal itself. We ascended the stair, our footsteps muffled by thick rugs. At the landing, Holmes halted before the door which Clara had earlier passed without comment. It was stoutly locked, its timbers dark with age. Holmes bent low, and with his magnifying lens inspected the threshold. "There has been traffic here," he murmured. "Observe, Watson, the faint mark of boots upon the board, the scratches about the lock, and here a droplet of wax hardened against the grain. A candle carried no doubt in stealth. The small sign appeared trivial enough, yet it seemed to me as though it opened a gulf of possibilities. Who had passed into the attic by night, and for what purpose? Why conceal the act, unless its object were sinister? Holmes straightened, his features composed, yet his eyes gleaming. Clara, who had lingered behind us, grew pale at his words. "There is nothing above but dust and rafters," she said hastily. "The door has not been opened these many months." Holmes inclined his head without reply, but I knew that her protest had carried no weight with him. He had already read in the wax and scratches a tale she would not willingly tell. Later that day, while Holmes continued his inquiries within, I took a turn through the village below. It was there that I encountered a farmer of rugged aspect, who, upon learning that I was guest at the Adler Chalet, shook his head gravely. "You are not the first to lodge beneath that roof, sir," he said. "On the night of Madame Adler's death, I was returning from the forest when I glimpsed a figure near the trees, tall, cloaked, and carrying a lantern. I hailed him, but he vanished among the pines. Since then, I keep clear of that path." The man spoke with the sincerity of one unskilled in invention, and his eyes betrayed genuine fear. I carried this account back to Holmes, who listened without surprise. "It corresponds, Watson, with the traces upon the attic door and the irregular snowshoes. The shadow that lingers here is not born of fancy alone." His words chilled me, for I could not but recall the fragments in the hearth and the air of secrecy which pervaded the household. It was clear to me that the chalet stood at the centre of some grim design. That evening, Holmes addressed Clara Adler with a courtesy so gentle that it disarmed even her reserve. He questioned her lightly of household matters, of the servants, of her mother's last days. Yet with every inquiry, she grew more constrained. Her replies were brief, her colour came and went, and at last she rose, declaring herself fatigued. When she had withdrawn, Holmes turned to me with a grave expression. "You observed, Watson, that she evaded the simplest questions. She is not guilty, but she is burdened with knowledge she dares not reveal. To the world she would appear merely reticent. To me, she betrays the struggle of one who walks upon a precipice." His words impressed me deeply, for I too had marked her trembling hands and averted eyes. Whatever secret she held, it was one that preyed upon her soul. As we retired for the night, I found myself unable to dismiss the image of the pale young woman, torn between fear and silence. The house seemed to press in upon us with the weight of unspoken truths. Holmes, calm and inscrutable, lit his pipe and gazed toward the attic stair, as though already certain where the path of inquiry must lead. That evening, as we sat together in the dimly lit salon, Holmes addressed Clara Adler with a gentleness that contrasted with the incisive sharpness I so often witnessed in him. "Mademoiselle," he said, "truth is a cord that tightens the longer it is withheld. If there is aught you conceal, its weight will only increase." The young woman clasped her hands tightly, her eyes fixed upon the fire. For a long while she made no answer, but at last she raised her head, and her voice, though trembling, carried the ring of desperate candour. "My mother," she whispered, "was not free of peril in her last months. She was subject to demands accompanied by threats. She was blackmailed." I started at the word, and Holmes inclined his head, his expression grave but unsurprised. "By whom?" he asked quietly. At this, Clara's courage seemed to fail her. Her gaze darted toward the window, as if she feared the dark might harbour listeners. "That I cannot say," she murmured. "To name him would be to invite destruction upon us both. I beg you, press me no further." Holmes regarded her intently, yet asked nothing more. But when she had withdrawn, he said in low tones to me, "You perceive, Watson, that she knows far more than she dares to speak. Fear, not ignorance, has sealed her, our lips." The storm which had threatened all day now broke upon the chalet with furious violence. The wind howled through the pines, and the snow lashed against the shutters with a ceaseless hiss. Within, all was silence, yet it was a silence heavy with dread. Every creak of the timbers seemed magnified. Every settling of the house echoed like the tread of unseen feet. I found myself unable to compose my mind to rest. Clara's revelation haunted me, and the sombre weight of the chalet pressed upon my spirits like a tangible burden. Holmes sat in his chair by the hearth, pipe in hand, his gaze abstracted. The glow of the fire illuminated the sharp profile of his face, giving him the appearance of a figure carved from marble, unyielding and inscrutable. At length he rose and bade me seek my rest. Yet as I retired to my chamber, I could not shake the impression that we were watched, and that the very walls conspired in secrecy. Outside, the gale shrieked as though in warning, while within, the hush of the house lay upon me with an oppression almost intolerable. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken by uneasy dreams. It was some hours after midnight when I was startled from half slumber by a faint sound beyond my door. I held my breath and listened. There came again the stealthy creak of boards, followed by the distinct shuffle of feet along the corridor. With every sense strained, I rose softly, and through the narrow crack of my door I beheld a figure pass. The man, or so I judged him, was cloaked and hooded, the faint glow of a lantern swinging in his grasp. His steps, though cautious, betrayed urgency, and his direction was unmistakable. He moved straight toward the attic stair. A thrill of mingled fear and excitement coursed through me. Here, at last, was proof that Clara's fears were not born of fancy, but that some secret traffic was indeed carried on within the house. Without pausing to rouse Holmes, I seized my revolver and followed upon the intruder's track. The lantern's glow danced ahead of me in the darkness. Each step I took echoed in my ears, and my heart beat wildly with anticipation. The silent corridor seemed transformed into the stage of a sinister drama, with myself cast suddenly into its perilous centre. At the attic landing the figure paused, the lantern flickering upon the locked door. But even as I hastened forward, he turned sharply, and with a sudden bound fled down the stair. I gave chase, my revolver in hand, my footsteps resounding in the hush of the house. Out through the hall and into the night he sped, the door banging wide upon its hinges. The storm struck me full in the face as I plunged after him, the snow driving so fiercely that my eyes watered and my breath caught in my throat. Yet the dark shape fled swiftly across the drifts, his lantern now extinguished, his form but a shadow among shadows. I fired a cry but received no answer save the shriek of the wind. I pressed on until I reached the edge of the woods, where the tracks lay clear in the snow, 2 parallel lines of snowshoes. Then, abruptly, the trail was lost. Whether by cunning artifice or the sheer fury of the storm, the footprints vanished into the whiteness. Alone and chilled to the bone, I was forced to return, baffled and disheartened, to the chalet where Holmes awaited. Holmes received me with a composure that stung my pride. I poured out my tale with eagerness, yet he merely drew at his pipe and regarded me with those calm, critical eyes. "You have courage, Watson," said he at last, "but courage unguided is a weapon as perilous as any foe. The intruder you pursued was prepared for flight, and you risked your life needlessly in the storm. The quarry is not to be taken by impulse, but by patience." I protested that the opportunity might never come again. Holmes shook his head. "It will come, my dear fellow. This house guards its secret as surely as the mountain guards its snow. Trust that when the time is ripe, the truth will declare itself, and we shall be here to seize it." His words, though severe, restored my confidence, and I resolved to await his judgment. That night the storm descended with a fury such as I had rarely witnessed. The chalet shuddered beneath the onslaught of the wind, while the snow drove against the shutters as though it would batter them from their hinges. The pines outside moaned like living creatures in distress, their branches groaning under the weight of ice. Within, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. Clara had retired early, pleading fatigue, but her pallor and trembling hands had betrayed the strain she endured. Holmes sat before the hearth, motionless, his chin resting upon his clasped fingers. The firelight flickered across his hawk-like profile, illuminating eyes that gleamed with that peculiar brightness which spoke of mind and body strung to their highest tension. I confessed to a sense of foreboding that I could not banish. Every creak of timber, every gust that rattled the panes, seemed to me like a herald of calamity. I paced the room restlessly, while Holmes remained silent, absorbed in thoughts too deep for my conjecture. Thus it was, with the storm raging without and suspense gnawing within, that we awaited the blow which instinct told us must soon fall. It was near midnight when the crisis came. A sudden cry pierced the howl of the wind, a woman's stifled scream from the floor above. In an instant, Holmes was upon his feet, and I followed him up the stair at a bound. Clara's chamber door stood ajar, and within we beheld a sight that froze the blood. A masked intruder, clad in dark garments, was bent over the girl's bed. One hand pressed a cloth against her mouth, while the other pinned her slight frame against the coverlet. Her eyes, wide with terror, gleamed in the dim light of the lamp. Holmes sprang with the swiftness of a striking hawk. He seized the assailant by the shoulder and wrenched him backward with such force that the man staggered. I rushed forward, but the villain, uttering a guttural curse, struck blindly at us both and dashed toward the window. Clara, released from his grip, gasped for breath, her hands clutching at the sheets. Before we could secure him, the intruder hurled open the casement and leapt into the night. A blast of snow and wind swept into the room, extinguishing the lamp and leaving us in sudden darkness. "Quick, Watson!" cried Holmes. "After him!" We stumbled out into the night, the storm lashing our faces with icy fury. The figure fled across the drifts, a dark shadow swallowed almost at once by the whiteness. Lantern in hand, I followed Holmes down the slope, the snow deep about our knees. The wind howled so that our cries to one another were snatched away before they reached our ears. At the edge of the clearing, Holmes halted, stooping to the ground. "Here, Watson!" he shouted above the gale. I bent beside him and saw plainly two sets of tracks impressed upon the snow, broad oval marks of snowshoes. One line led from the house, the other fresher joined it a few yards distant. "There were two," Holmes muttered. "One entered earlier, the other gave aid in flight. The storm will soon blot them out, but we have the proof we need." Indeed, even as he spoke, the furious wind drove fresh drifts across the trail, effacing the prints as though they had never been. To pursue further was hopeless. With heavy hearts and chilled limbs, we returned to the chalet, where Clara awaited us in a state of collapse. We found her in the salon, half fainting upon the couch, her face deathly pale, her lips still quivering from the violence she had endured. Holmes, with a tenderness rare in him, pressed a cordial to her lips and bade me chafe her hands until colour returned to her cheeks. At length she spoke, her voice low and broken. "It is useless to deny it further. You must know the truth. My mother, God rest her soul, once harboured here, in this very house, a man whom all the world sought. He was no common criminal, but a fugitive of politics, a revolutionary from Vienna, who had fled across Europe with spies at his heels. My mother sheltered him in the attic, concealed him even from the servants, and for months he lived there like a ghost, venturing out only at night." She covered her face with her hands. "I was a child then, but I remember his shadow upon the wall, his footsteps above my chamber. My mother told me he was a distant cousin, sick and in need of rest. But I knew better. I felt the secrecy that clung about him. And then one day, without farewell, he was gone. My mother never spoke of him again." Her voice rose in a cry of anguish. "But he did not leave of his own will. I am sure of it. He vanished, and with him vanished her peace. From that day her life was darkened, until death claimed her. And now the danger has returned." Clara's confession fell into silence, broken only by the storm outside. At last she raised her eyes, filled with unshed tears, and continued with trembling earnestness. My terror is this, that the man never truly left the chalet. His fate is bound up within these walls. My mother's letters grew strange in those years, full of hints and half-spoken fears. She burned papers in the hearth and barred the attic with her own hand. I believe, though I dread to say it, that he met his end here, and that some dreadful secret lies buried in the house. Holmes regarded her with deep attention. And you connect this secret with your mother's death? Yes, she whispered. She knew too much. She lived with that knowledge until it destroyed her. And now others come, seeking what was hidden, and silencing those who stand in their way. Her words, spoken with such conviction, sent a chill through me, deeper than any alpine wind. Holmes alone remained composed, though his eyes gleamed with that cold fire which betokened the scent of truth. "Fear not, mademoiselle," he said gravely. "The past may be buried, but it cannot remain so forever. We shall unearth it." The following morning, when Clara had regained some composure, Holmes and I withdrew to the salon, where he spread his notes and small collection of fragments upon the table. His manner was calm, deliberate, yet his eyes shone with the intensity of one to whom the tangled skein was at last beginning to yield. "Let us recapitulate, Watson," said he. "First, we have the papers half burned in the hearth, bearing the word verat, betrayal. Second, the snowshoes of unequal size, betraying an intruder's hurried choice. Third, the wax upon the attic door, proof of nocturnal visitation. And lastly, the evidence of the farmer, who saw a cloaked stranger upon the fatal night." He placed each clue in its order, as a barrister marshals his exhibits before a jury. Individually, each might be dismissed as trivial. Taken together, they form a chain, one which tightens about the same point. I leaned forward, struck by his composure amidst so sinister an array. "And that point, Holmes?" He tapped the table lightly with his long forefinger. "The attic, Watson. Whatever has passed in this house, its centre lies above our heads." A thrill of expectation ran through me at his words. Holmes rose and paced the room, his voice low but charged with conviction. "Consider, Watson, Clara's tale of a fugitive sheltered in the attic, a man pursued by enemies. He vanishes, without trace. The villagers whisper of lights and figures about the chalet. Years pass, and the mother grows wan and fearful, until death claims her. Now, intruders return, searching not for treasure of gold, but for that which the dead alone might conceal." I followed his reasoning with mounting dread. "You suggest, Holmes?" "That the man never left these walls," said he solemnly. "He died here, murdered, perhaps betrayed, and his remains were hidden in the very place where he once drew breath. The chalet has stood all these years as his silent sepulchre." The words struck me with horror. I glanced instinctively toward the ceiling, half expecting to hear the echo of those long-lost footsteps. Holmes continued. "The fire-blackened scraps, the hurried destruction of incriminating letters, betray knowledge of the crime. The mismatched snowshoes show us that others still seek to penetrate the secret. And the wax on the attic door, a furtive hand prying into the grave of the past." He halted before the window, his tall figure outlined against the snowy glare. "Yes, Watson. The chalet itself is the tomb of a vanished man." Holmes resumed his seat, his expression sharpened with that cold precision which accompanied his most decisive judgments. "The motive, Watson, is writ large. This was no ordinary exile, but a revolutionary, the custodian of papers of grave importance. Such documents would have value to enemies abroad and to unscrupulous men at home. They would inspire fear in governments and greed in those who trafficked in secrets." I recalled Clara's words with a shudder. Her mother's blackmailer, then, was none other than the possessor of that knowledge. "Just so," Holmes replied. First came silence, brought by threats. Then, as years passed and the trail grew cold, there arose a bolder attempt. Intrusion, violence, and near murder. The object is constant, to unearth that which was hidden in the attic. His tone was quiet, yet the logic was inexorable. Each fragment of evidence, which to me had seemed isolated and obscure, now fell into place beneath the steady hand of his reasoning. Holmes leaned back, his fingers pressed together. We face an adversary both ruthless and calculating, but he has made one error. He believes that time and fear will keep the truth buried. That belief will prove his undoing. I urged Holmes to take immediate action, to break open the attic and lay bare the truth. He, however, shook his head with the faintest of smiles. My dear Watson, precipitate measures serve only to warn the guilty. We must allow our adversary to reveal himself. If he believes that the secret remains hidden, he will persist in his efforts. But if he fears discovery, then we shall witness his mask fall of its own accord. He leaned closer, speaking with deliberate emphasis. Therefore, we must arrange a little theatre. We shall declare our intention of opening the attic publicly. That announcement will act as the spark to the powder. The guilty man cannot but betray himself when the hour approaches. I could not deny the sagacity of his plan, though it filled me with apprehension. To stand knowingly in the path of danger required a calmness of nerve such as only Holmes possessed in perfection. He lit his pipe, the blue smoke curling upward in tranquil spirals, as though the storm we faced were but an intellectual diversion. Trust me, Watson, he said quietly. We shall not seek the truth. The truth shall come to us. That evening, assembled in the salon, Holmes addressed Clara and the servants with grave formality. Tomorrow night, he said, we shall open the attic before all present. Whatever it conceals will be brought to light. I trust that each of you will attend. The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. Clara turned pale, her lips parting as though to protest, yet she remained silent. Keller, the steward, cast a swift glance toward his wife, then dropped his eyes. I thought I detected a tremor in his hand as he folded his arms. Holmes's gaze moved slowly from face to face, his expression inscrutable. The truth waits above us, he said simply. Let us meet it together. With that he dismissed the assembly. But to me he whispered, watch them closely, Watson. By their looks tonight, we may already know who fears tomorrow. The following evening, Holmes carried out his design with the precision of a general marshalling his forces. By his request, Clara, pale yet resolute, assembled in the salon, together with the 2 servants and a handful of neighbours from the valley, men whose respect for the Adler name lent gravity to their presence. Each entered with visible unease, for the storm of the previous night still lingered in their memory, and whispers of strange doings at the chalet had spread through the village. Holmes stood before the company, tall and composed, his manner that of one about to conduct an inquiry of official weight. Friends, said he, we are met here to confront not superstition, but truth. The attic of this house conceals a secret, and tomorrow would be too late. Tonight, before all present, that secret shall be revealed. The words fell like a solemn charge, and I confess my own heart quickened with apprehension. Clara clutched at the arm of her chair, her eyes fixed upon Holmes, as though upon a saviour. Keller, the steward, shifted restlessly, his wife casting anxious glances in his direction. Thus the stage was set for the revelation Holmes had so carefully prepared. Holmes ascended the stair with lantern in hand, the company following in tense silence. The locked door yielded readily to his key, and together we entered the attic, a vast chamber beneath the rafters, filled with dust and cobwebs, its air close and heavy with disuse. Holmes moved directly to the far wall, where the beams bore signs of recent disturbance. With deliberate care, he prized at a loosened plank, the wood groaning under his leverage. At last it gave way, and the lantern's glow fell upon a sight that drew a gasp of horror from every throat. There, within the recess, lay the mouldering remains of a man. The skeleton, clothed in tattered garments of foreign cut, was crumpled as though thrust hastily into concealment. Upon the floor beside it lay the rusted frame of a lantern, its glass long since shattered. Clara gave a low cry and buried her face in her hands. Even the hardy villagers crossed themselves, murmuring prayers under their breath. For myself, I confess a shudder seized me, and my blood ran cold at the thought of that silent witness entombed above our heads through all those years. Holmes alone remained unmoved. His keen eyes scanned the recess, noting every detail, while his voice rang clear. "Behold, Watson, the fugitive who never left." In the hush that followed this dreadful revelation, I turned instinctively toward the assembled household. It was then that my gaze fell upon Keller, the steward. His face, which had hitherto borne the mask of stolidity, had drained to the pallor of death. His lips moved soundlessly, and his eyes fixed upon the skeleton with a horror greater than that of simple discovery. Holmes observed him keenly. Keller's hands trembled. He swayed as though the ground itself betrayed him. Then, with a sudden violent gesture, he made for the door. "Stop him!" Holmes's command rang out. Two of the villagers seized the man as he attempted to thrust them aside. He struggled with surprising strength, but the futility of his resistance soon overcame him, and he sank into a chair, gasping like one undone. Holmes regarded him without triumph. "Your conscience, Keller, has spoken more eloquently than any words. Before I utter a syllable, you have betrayed yourself." The steward bowed his head, his chest heaving, while the others stood transfixed by the collapse of one they had long trusted. Clara, pale and trembling, stared at him as though seeing for the first time the true face of her household. Holmes stepped forward, his voice measured, yet inexorable. "Let us place the facts in their order. Years ago this man, a revolutionary from Vienna, sought refuge here. He was received by Madame Adler, whose compassion outweighed her caution. But Keller, coveting the papers entrusted to the fugitive's keeping, struck him down and concealed his body within these walls." A murmur passed among the villagers. Holmes raised his hand for silence. From that hour, Keller became master of his mistress's life. He wielded his knowledge as a weapon, extorting her silence by threats of exposure. The word verat, betrayal, preserved in the ashes, bears witness to her torment. At last, when her strength failed and her courage waned, Keller silenced her with poison, that the secret might perish with her. A gasp escaped Clara, and she half rose as though to protest. But Holmes continued, inexorable as fate. The recent attempts, the intrusions and violence, were but his last effort to recover the papers, the one prize still denied him. The mismatched snowshoes, the candle at the attic door, the cloaked figure glimpsed in the wood, all point to his hand. Holmes's eyes fixed upon Keller. "You are guilty of murder, twice committed, and of treachery, most vile." Keller's head sank lower, yet Holmes pressed on, his tone now coldly explanatory rather than accusatory. "The motive is plain. Those papers entrusted to the fugitive contained intelligence of a most dangerous kind, details of banking transactions and secret alliances which, if exposed, could have shaken the financial houses of Europe to their foundations. In the right hands, they were worth a fortune. In the wrong, they were weapons capable of sowing discord among nations." He glanced at me, as though to mark the gravity of the revelation. "Greed, Watson, allied with fear, is a combination deadly to both conscience and reason. Keller slew to obtain them, and when he failed, he sought by terror and secrecy to preserve his advantage. But the truth, though buried for years, has emerged, as truth must." The villagers murmured, their faces a mixture of awe and indignation. Clara, her eyes wide with horror, seemed scarcely able to grasp the depth of betrayal. Holmes concluded quietly. Thus, in pursuit of documents not his own, Keller stained these walls with blood and made of this chalet a vault of silence. The scene that followed was one of profound dismay. Clara sank back, weeping silently, her slender frame shaken by the weight of unveiled horror. The neighbours, who had gathered in respect for her family, now exchanged glances of indignation and pity, whispering in low tones of treachery hidden beneath their very eyes. Keller sat slumped, a broken figure, while his wife wrung her hands in mute despair. The chalet, once merely a dwelling, had been transformed into a theatre of revelation and ruin, its every timber seeming to echo with the crimes it had concealed for so many years. Holmes assembled us once more within the sombre walls of the chalet. Clara sat pale but composed, her hands folded tightly before her. The neighbours, summoned again, stood with grave faces, while Keller, guarded by two sturdy men, remained sullen and silent. A hush of expectation lay upon all, for each knew that the hour of truth had come. Holmes stood by the hearth, his tall figure commanding the attention of every eye. "My friends," he began, in tones deliberate and calm, "the shadows that have long haunted this house shall tonight be dispelled. The tale is grim, but its telling is necessary, for only in light does justice breathe." So saying, he commenced his reconstruction of the crime. "The man who sought refuge here," Holmes began, "was no harmless wanderer, but a revolutionary of Vienna, fleeing with dangerous knowledge in his possession. Madame Adler, moved by compassion, granted him shelter in this attic, but her generosity proved his doom. Keller, ever watchful, discerned both the secret of his presence and the value of the documents he bore. Under pretense of assistance, he won the fugitive's confidence, only to strike him down when opportunity arose. The body, hastily concealed within the wall, became the chalet's hidden horror. I confess a shudder passed through me as Holmes's words revived the dreadful image. The household listened in appalled silence, and Keller's head sank lower upon his breast. "Thus," Holmes continued, "the man who entered these doors to escape pursuit never again beheld the light of freedom." "But crime breeds crime," Holmes resumed, his eyes fixed sternly upon Keller. "Madame Adler, though deceived, was no fool. She detected inconsistencies, the scent of wax, the altered beams, the sudden disappearance of her guest without farewell. She may not have known the whole, but she divined enough to threaten Keller's security. Instead of flight, he chose silence. By poison, subtle and insidious, he stilled her suspicions forever. The world accepted the verdict of natural death, but her pallor and declining health were the tokens of slow murder." Clara stifled a sob at these words, burying her face in her hands. Holmes's voice softened a little, though it remained inexorable. In sparing the fugitive's enemies abroad, Keller betrayed his mistress at home and added her life to the tally of his guilt. Holmes now produced the tattered fragments recovered from the hearth. "These scraps," he said, "bear the word verat, betrayal. They are relics of correspondence burned in haste. Keller sought not only to silence witnesses, but to secure documents of high political moment. These papers concerned financial dealings and secret treaties capable of unsettling Europe itself. It was not loyalty nor fear that guided him, but greed, the lust to trade knowledge for power. He searched, and still searches, for what the dead man once guarded. The attacks upon Clara, the nocturnal prowling, the violence of these last days, all were but the final spasms of that quest, interrupted only by our arrival. I saw Clara raise her eyes to Holmes with a mixture of dread and gratitude, as though clinging to his strength against the ruin of her house. Holmes turned now to the evidence, his voice calm, each word weighted like a stone. What bound Keller irrevocably to these deeds? First, the snowshoes, mismatched, chosen in haste for his flight. No honest mountaineer would have endured their discomfort, yet they led us to his door. Second, the wax upon the attic threshold, melted from a candle carried in stealth, betraying visits he would have denied. Third, the scraps in the hearth, burned to ashes, yet still breathing the word verat, a silent cry from the dead. Add to these the testimony of the neighbour who glimpsed a cloaked figure near the woods, and Clara's own confession of her mother's fears, and the chain is complete. He paused, his eyes sweeping the assembly. Trifles, gentlemen, but trifles in concert compose a symphony of guilt. The villagers murmured assent, while Keller's lips quivered with impotent rage. Thus, Holmes concluded, the scattered tokens unite. A fugitive vanishes, a woman dies, intruders prowl, and the house whispers of secrets untold. Each fact, isolated, may be dismissed. Together they form a pattern as inevitable as the march of time. From ashes, from snow, from wax and word, the truth rises inexorably, pointing to the hand of Keller. I marvelled, as so often before, at the lucidity of Holmes's exposition, which illuminated the darkest recesses of the case with the light of reason. The company listened as though spellbound, each syllable tightening the noose about the guilty man. Holmes's eyes, cold and steady, never left Keller, who sat rigid, his knuckles white upon the arms of his chair. Holmes's final words fell like a judge's sentence. Keller stands revealed, the murderer of the fugitive and of his mistress, the plunderer of secrets not his own. A hush followed. Clara sobbed quietly, the neighbours exchanged glances of horror, and Keller, crushed by the weight of truth, sank into abject silence. Our return to London was accomplished without incident, yet the memory of the chalet clung to me like a shadow. As the train rattled across the fields of France, and thence through the Channel to our native shores, I could not forget the sight of those snowbound rafters under which such horrors had lain concealed. The contrast between the silent majesty of the Alps and the ceaseless stir of the city struck me forcibly. London, with its thronged thoroughfares, its omnibuses and hansoms, and the eternal clamour of wheels, seemed a world removed from the haunted silence of the mountains. Yet beneath its crowded surface, I reflected, might lurk secrets no less dreadful than those we had unearthed abroad. Holmes spoke little during our journey, though I could see by the set of his features that his mind was still engaged upon the case. Only when the familiar outlines of Baker Street came into view did I note the faint relaxation of his expression, as though the return to his accustomed den of thought restored him to equilibrium. Thus, from storm and solitude, we passed once more into the heart of civilization, bearing with us memories that civilization itself could not wholly dispel. That evening found us once more before our own fire, the curtains drawn against the London fog, and the comfort of familiarity settling upon me like a balm. Holmes occupied his armchair, his long limbs stretched at ease, his pipe between his fingers. Yet there was in his attitude none of that restless energy which so often possessed him in idle hours. Instead, he seemed weighted with reflection, his keen features softened by a rare weariness. The light of the flames played upon his face, revealing lines which spoke of mental strain more than physical fatigue. For a long while he remained silent, his eyes fixed upon the glow as though reading there the shadows of alpine rafters and the image of that hidden skeleton. I refrained from interrupting him, sensing that his thoughts were still grappling with the moral dimensions of the tragedy. At length, with a sigh, he drew upon his pipe and said simply, "The human heart, Watson, furnishes mysteries more impenetrable than any locked chamber. We but lift a corner of the veil, and the darkness beneath is endless." It was not often that Holmes betrayed such heaviness, and the moment impressed itself deeply upon me. In the days that followed, my thoughts turned often to Clara Adler. Hers had been a trial cruel beyond measure, the loss of her mother by treachery, the revelation of crimes hidden within her very home, and the collapse of the one servant upon whom she had long depended. Yet in her bearing, once the first storm of grief had passed, there was a dignity that moved me profoundly. She chose to remain for a time in the valley, not from weakness, but from duty. With calm resolve, she set herself to restore order to the ruined household, showing kindness to the villagers who had been witnesses of her family's shame. Though her heart was laden with sorrow, she bore it without complaint, as though conscious that courage was the only tribute left to her mother's memory. Holmes observed her with that quiet respect he seldom bestowed. "The true strength of character, Watson," he remarked, "is most clearly revealed not in triumph, but in endurance." I recorded these words with care, for I too had seen in Clara Adler an example of fortitude which no calamity could wholly crush. Her figure remains with me still, a symbol of resilience amid ruin. One evening, as we sat together, Holmes spoke at greater length upon the case. "Reflect, Watson," said he, "upon the irony of that Alpine chalet. To its builders it was a refuge, a retreat from the burdens of the world, designed for safety and family pride. Yet what was it in reality? A prison for a fugitive, a vault for a corpse, a stage for betrayal. That which should have embodied protection became instead the vessel of secrecy and death." His words stirred in me a vivid recollection of the snow-laden roof and shuttered windows, so seemingly secure, yet harbouring within their beams a crime long buried. "It is thus with human contrivances," Holmes continued. "We raise walls to defend ourselves, but they may serve equally to conceal our darkest deeds. The strength of timber or stone is nothing compared to the frailty of human loyalty." As he spoke, I realized that for him, the chalet had ceased to be a mere dwelling. It had become an emblem of the peril that lies in secrecy itself. To me also, it stood henceforth not as a house of refuge, but as a monument to the cost of silence and hidden guilt. Holmes fell into a deep silence, his gaze fixed upon the fire. At last he spoke with slow emphasis, as though shaping his thoughts into a maxim. "It is not the peaks that threaten us, Watson, but the shadows we ourselves cast within our walls. The mountains stand immutable, sublime in their indifference. They neither harm nor protect. The peril lies in men, men who carry into the shelter of their homes ambition, envy, and greed. Those are the shadows that corrupt safety into peril, refuge into trap." The words, uttered in that calm, penetrating voice, impressed themselves upon me with peculiar force. I thought of Clara's mother, who had opened her doors to a fugitive, only to harbour unwittingly her own destroyer. I thought of Keller, whose loyalty, if loyalty it may be called, was but a mask for avarice. And I thought of the silent attic, heavy with dust and years, bearing mute testimony to betrayal hidden behind stout beams. Holmes continued, "It is not nature we must fear, nor the storms that beat upon our roofs, but the storms that breed within men's hearts. Give them secrecy, and they will thrive as mould thrives in darkness. Expose them to light, and their power withers." Such reflections, though stern, revealed a depth in my friend which the world seldom saw. Beneath his cold logic lay an understanding of human frailty that was both compassionate and severe. Holmes, after a pause, turned to the political significance of the affair. "Had those papers been recovered and loosed upon the world, Watson, they might have altered the very balance of Europe. Bankers ruined, governments shaken, alliances disrupted. One man's greed could have plunged nations into discord. It is a sobering thought that such peril lay hidden in a remote Alpine chalet, while the great capitals slept in ignorance." I was struck anew by the strange interweaving of the personal and the political, the grief of a solitary household bound by threads to the fate of empires. Holmes, however, regarded it with characteristic detachment. "It is but one instance," he said, "of how the smallest concealments may reverberate upon the grandest stage. Europe totters always upon a knife edge, and a single secret may tilt the balance." And thus I close this record, with feelings of solemnity not easily set aside. Justice, in its earthly form, had been served, yet the air of tragedy hung still about the chalet, and in Clara's steadfast face I read the truth that some wounds never wholly heal. Holmes, for his part, resumed his accustomed life with apparent ease, yet I knew that the case lingered in his reflections. So too it lingers in mine. For though we unmasked the guilty and laid bare the past, the shadows within men's hearts remain, silent, hidden, and ever awaiting their hour. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire throwing sharp angles across his features. You see, Watson, the chalet was built to be a refuge, yet it became a tomb. It is not the storms upon the mountain that imperil us most, but the storms we invite within our own walls. Secrecy, fear, and greed. These are enemies far more destructive than snow or stone. I could not but agree, for the image of that attic and its hidden burden would remain with me always. And now, a question for you. What do you think was Keller's gravest error? The murders he committed, or the arrogance that made him believe the truth would never surface? Share your thoughts below. I would be most curious to read them. And if you enjoyed this case, do subscribe for more mysteries of Holmes, and share this story with those who cherish the thrill of deduction.